Welcome back, everybody. Here we are once again looking at expansion in the 1830s and 40s. Today, we are going to look at one specific territory, and that is, of course, Texas. So, we're going to see today how Texas first came to be settled by a lot of Americans and how Texas eventually even fought and won its independence from Mexico and then became annexed as a new state in the United States in 1845. And I think it's safe to say, and I bet many of you would agree, that of all US states, Texas seems to have just a real personality, a real sense of self, a real sense of identity, whether it's through kind of, cliche things like little phrases, everything's bigger in Texas, don't mess with Texas, this kind of thing. But for better or for worse, Texans definitely have a sense of who they are and a sense of uniqueness. Maybe we could even call it Texas nationalism that we kind of see. And Texas, maybe that's fair because Texas has quite a unique history. There are some things that Texas can say that no other state can. Particularly, Texas is the only state in the United States that existed as its own country for a while, that was its own independent nation for a short time, about 9 years. There are lots of states, of course, that can claim or that were parts of other countries or claimed by other countries and things like that. But Texas existed as its own nation for a short period of time. And perhaps that contributes to this sense of uniqueness, this sense of self, a sense of identity. And I think this whole Texan kind of toughness thing that we sometimes get, this sort of, I don't know if you want to call it sort of a macho attitude or whatever. I think some of the things today will show us where that comes from and maybe even make the case that it's kind of warranted, maybe certainly not unwarranted in a lot of cases. So let's begin by talking about Texas and how that came of interest to Americans and how Americans came to start settling in Texas. So, first of all, let's just remind ourselves obviously, I think we all know where Texas is. I think we can make the case that of all U.S. states, Texas is one of the more recognizable ones that, we sometimes struggle if you were just shown a picture of a state like Wyoming or Colorado, we'd probably have trouble, designating what that is. But Texas, probably most people know where that one is for sure. But Texas, at this point where we are beginning to look at it, 1820s, I guess we could say, is probably a good starting point. Texas is a part of Mexico. It's one of the northernmost provinces of Mexico. Not incredibly populated, kind of sparsely populated at the time. And recall that when Mexico was a colony of Spain, Spain was not all that adamant about really developing it or making, encouraging settlement or any kind of economic stimulation or things like that. But that all changed when Mexico got their independence from Spain in 1820. And so that increased economic interest with the United States and economic interest, therefore, in Texas. So by the time we get to the 1820s or so, Mexico is interested in getting Texas, recruiting more settlement into Texas, getting more people to start moving there, farming there, get something going there that could make Texas profitable, that could make it something that was a more defensive kind of location. If you had a lot of people living there, it's not just this wide open space. And so, to do that, to encourage settlement, Mexico looks to Americans. So they try to recruit American settlers to come and settle and live and farm and ranch or whatever in Texas. So we start to see a large amount of American settlement into Texas sometime about the 1820s and into 1830s. And the Americans were enticed and encouraged to do so. The Mexican government, intentionally tries to create a situation that Americans would be attracted to. They made it very, very easy for Americans to settle in Texas. They, got rid of any sort of, really harsh immigration laws or any kind of bureaucracy or red tape. Made it pretty easy for Americans to come in there. Easy to gain land, very inexpensive land, very generous land grants that Americans were attracted to. And really just kind of give them a whole lot of freedoms, trying to make this a very enticing kind of a situation. So offering them inexpensive land, will leave you alone. They don't have to pay taxes, or they're exempt from a lot of taxes. And we know how Americans feel about that. So that was a big, carrot that they're offering to American settlers to try to encourage them to come. And that was quite successful for a while. A particular person we need to note when looking at Texas settlement by Americans, which I usually just refer to them as Texans from here on if I talk about Texans. I mean, Americans living in Texas, which again is part of Mexico. But that person is Stephen Austin. And I bet already a lot of you were going, oh, okay, I get it. Austin, Texas, right? And you're correct. So it's pretty easy to remember that Stephen Austin has something to do with Texas. And the capital city of Texas, Austin, Texas, does bear his name. Stephen Austin is considered the father of Texas, thus the naming of the capital after him, and so forth. He is considered the father of Texas because he recruited and brought some of those first American families to come and settle in Texas. So probably about the first 100 or so, or a couple of hundred, were sort of recruited, organized, and the whole thing sort of led by Stephen Austin, and then more settlement is going to follow. And again, this was a situation that Mexico wanted, and it worked very, very well. This was a very enticing offer, and a lot of Americans saw a lot of promise in Texas. And so, over the next several years, you do have a significant amount of American settlement there. Now, the purpose, remember, for the Mexican government, what they assumed would happen was that over time, these people would start to really consider themselves Mexican. Now, going back again to the conditions here, they did offer generous land. They did exempt them from a lot of taxes and give them a lot of freedoms, but there were some things that they were supposed to do. There were some rules that the Americans were supposed to follow. They were supposed to obey Mexican law. They were supposed to, do anything, pretty much just do what Mexican government asked them to do, but they felt they weren't asking them to do much. That included a ban on slavery, and that also included converting to Catholicism. I've mentioned before that Mexico was and is a very Catholic nation. That's the official religion, and so they did request that American settlers practice and observe Catholicism, which for the most part they didn't. So what happens over time, or let me get to what Mexico thought was going to happen. Their overall plan here, what they thought would happen was that over time, over a couple of years, or certainly a generation later, that these Texans, these Americans, would sort of just get absorbed into Mexican society, that they would start to consider themselves Mexican. They would start to, respect the Mexican government and see the Mexican government as their own. They would start to, speak Spanish. They would be Catholic, all of those things. And then a generation or so later, they really would have shed their American identity and, really become Mexican. But the opposite happens. Instead of them starting to consider themselves Mexican, we see more of an Americanization of Texas. These people, for one thing, they didn't follow a lot of the rules that the Mexican government had put down. They do not respect that ban on slavery. They bring slaves into Texas, so there is a heavy slave population. They don't convert to Catholicism. They don't practice Catholicism. They just really don't identify or create any kind of bond or affection towards the Mexican state. They continue to consider themselves American. So instead of these Americans becoming Mexicanized, if that's a word, it's the other way around. Texas is starting to look more and more American, and it seems like to the Mexican government that this whole idea is kind of backfiring on them, and they're getting very, very concerned that these Americans are, too close to the United States. They don't respect the Mexican government. They're openly flouting the law. This is a bad situation if we continue to let it happen, and we're going to lose Texas if we don't do something about this. So in response to that growing Americanization of Texas, concern over losing Texas, concern that these Texans are going to get more and more defiant, and even the concern that this whole thing is kind of a plot by the United States to eventually gain Texas, to eventually add it in, that causes Mexico to change the rules, to change their policy, and to stop being so lenient on these Texans and to reverse course on what they had originally offered. So Mexico is going to change their policy, change the rules in a way that, of course, Americans are not going to like. For one thing, they're going to cut off all the immigration, ban further immigration into Texas. They had been allowing very, very free and open and quite generous, very relaxed immigration into Texas. They had encouraged it. They had wanted it. Now they're saying no more. That is enough. Now, despite that, Americans are still going to settle into Texas. So there will be an extreme amount of illegal immigration into Texas, into Mexico, and that will further make Mexico angry and further prove their suspicion that, this whole thing is a plot by the United States, or Americans are plotting to do something, all that kind of stuff. So that continues to be worrisome, despite the fact that they've changed the rules. Then they're going to crack down even harder on them. They're going to start making them pay taxes that they had previously exempted them from. They're going to start trying to enforce that ban on slavery. They're just overall going to come down harder on the Texans, realizing that their loose approach was backfiring. And as you can imagine, the Texans did not like that one bit, that they were very angry about. We've had all these really nice loose rules and now you're enforcing it. They continue to just disobey the law and rule there anyway. And so the situation is getting rather tense between the two. Things get even worse when there is some political upheaval and political changes in Mexico. When General Antonio Santa Anna, or Santa Anna if you prefer, General Antonio Santa Anna becomes essentially the dictator of Mexico. He seizes power in Mexico somehow. He dissolves their Congress, gets rid of it, and basically just props himself up as essentially a dictator. And we probably know how Americans then, and certainly even now, feel about dictators or kings or anyone with kind of absolute power. And so they absolutely did not like Santa Anna. Saw him as what he was, which was a dictator, and were very fearful that this was, going to further make their situation quite unlivable. And it did. He abolished the Mexican Constitution. He abolished rights and things like that Americans and other Mexican citizens had been promised. We know how Americans feel about that. So for as many Texans felt similar reasons that they had fought a revolution of independence against Britain, many started to feel that maybe that's what they needed to do in regard to Mexico. They're paying unfair taxes. Their rights have been abolished. You got a dictator in power. And they tried to negotiate things for a while, but that never worked. Now, another personality we need to know in regard to all of this is Sam Houston. And once again, I bet you're looking at that and saying, okay, I get it. Houston is in Houston, Texas. And you're right. Houston, the city of Houston, Texas, not the capital, but one of the larger cities in Texas, is named for Sam Houston. Sam Houston becomes a leader of the Texans, will become the first governor of Texas, and he really is kind of leading Texas, whether you want to call him a governor or whatever, but leading them in their eventual fight for independence. So he's sort of in charge, I guess you could say. Tries to negotiate with Santa Anna for a while, but that never proves fruitful. And so eventually, after many failed negotiations and many failed attempts to try to work this out and get Texans' rights restored and all that kind of stuff, Houston agrees that fighting for independence is the only answer. And so Sam Houston will be leading Texans in their fight for independence. So all of these problems will then lead to the Texas Revolution. And the Texas Revolution is Texans, these Americans fighting, living in Texas, fighting for their independence, rebelling against the Mexican government. So this doesn't have anything to do with the United States technically. The United States is not officially involved in this. These are Americans, but it's not the United States government that is at war with Mexico. We will look at that later. That's going to happen soon. But these are these individual settlers of Texas fighting for independence against Mexico. Now, the United States isn't officially involved, but you can probably imagine the United States was absolutely, behind the scenes, whispering, nudging, rooting for Texans for sure. And there were a lot of Americans who fought, who came to Texas to fight. They did recruit. They knew they were going to have more in order to defeat Mexico. They were going to have more people than their own men. And so they did recruit and advertised, come help us fight, come help us fight. And there were probably about 30,000 or so other Americans that did not live in Texas, mostly from the South, that came to fight amongst the Texans in their war of independence from Mexico. Now, we are going to look at two particular battles or two particular notable fights of the Texan Revolution. One of those is the Alamo, the events that occurred at the Alamo. And the Alamo, many of you may have heard of. Some of you may have been there, may have seen it. It's an important battle of the Texas Revolution that also just kind of comes to define, Texans in general. It becomes a sort of a defining moment. It becomes a source of identity. It becomes a great source of Texan pride. And I think maybe you'll see why when we talk about what happened. So this is the Alamo, what remains of it today. It's in San Antonio, right down the middle of downtown, which you have to kind of imagine at the time in 1835, 36, when this battle was being fought, there wasn't a big city around it. There weren't all these big tall buildings and skyscrapers surrounding it. It was like a bunch of farmland. The building itself is quite small today. At the time, though, it would have been much, much, much bigger. In fact, that's one of the reasons why it was kind of difficult to defend. But the Alamo is this old Catholic mission that you see here. Remember when the Spanish colonized, conversion to Catholicism, missionary work was a big part of their agenda. So there are a lot of Catholic missions like this spread out throughout the former Spanish colonies. And so the Alamo is this old Catholic mission, big position, and some Texan troops approach it. They are given orders actually from Houston, from the higher ups, to destroy it. But when they get there, the Texas leaders, fighters, led by actually an Alabamian named William Travis, decides that the Alamo is too important to destroy. This is too important of a strategic location. It's too important of a defensive location. We should not destroy it. We need to defend it. So they choose instead, they disobey the orders, defend the Alamo instead. And the story of the Alamo is the story of these, a couple of hundred Texan fighters and women and children huddled in the basement as well, trying desperately to defend the Alamo while it is under siege by the Mexican army. So the Mexican army is surrounding the Alamo, trying to force out these Texan defenders. And they last for 13 days. For 13 days, they withstand occasional artillery and firing and things like that from the Mexican army, hoping to get reinforcements. They have sent word out that they're defending the Alamo. They're wanting other Texan forces to come, and they hold out as best they can for 13 whole days. So almost 2 weeks they last inside the Alamo, defending it, waiting for help that is unfortunately never going to come. That help does not arrive, and after that 13 days of intense standoff, Mexican forces breach the Alamo. Even once they get inside the Alamo, the Texan defenders, despite being drastically outnumbered, still last for about 4 hours. So an ugly hand-to-hand bloody fight goes on for 4 hours before the Alamo is captured by Mexican forces, and all of the American Texan defenders of the Alamo were killed. Some of the women and children were spared and survived, but all of the defenders of the Alamo were otherwise killed, including some big names, people like Davy Crockett. Some people don't realize he was a real person, but he was, and he went to Texas and defended the Alamo and died defending the Alamo, as all of the Texan defenders did. So that begs the question then, if they lose the Alamo, if they're all killed, why is this such a big thing? Well, it's important strategically, but it may even have greater significance in an emotional and psychological kind of a sense. Strategically, this did buy valuable time. This bought time for Texan forces elsewhere to get organized. It bought them time to get ready. It distracted Mexican forces that were there trying to take the Alamo. So it gave them time to get themselves together for the fight that was coming. And that's often an understanding of the mentality of the Alamo defenders, the idea that they knew they were going to die, they knew it was hopeless, and that they sacrificed themselves so that other Texans would be successful. But as well as the strategic importance of it, the psychological, and I'm getting ahead of myself. There you go, significance. Already told you one thing. The psychological ramifications. You would think that this is a devastating blow to Texans, and it is. But as we've seen in similar situations, instead of it making Texans want to give up and ready to give in and ready to surrender, it just gets them more fired up. This just lights a fire under some of them, like hasn't happened before. They are more motivated. They are ready for revenge. They are so appalled at what has happened. They are so shocked by it. They are so angry about it that they are ready for revenge, and they are going to take it out on the Mexican army when the next chance that they get. So it gives them time. It gives them an extra motivation. It gives them some extra energy, and this desire to avenge the Alamo and all of that. And perhaps because of this brave standoff, the fact that the Texans last for 13 whole days and then 4 hours, that some do criticize and say that it was silly and they shouldn't have done it. They should have just destroyed it as they were originally ordered. But others see this, of course, as a great act of heroism, a great act of self-sacrifice. And the Alamo is very much a rather sacred sort of a place, kind of hallowed ground, even though it's very odd looking. If you ever go see it, it's odd because you have this picture right here with this sprawling downtown, no modern downtown all around it. Some people complain that they shouldn't have allowed big high rises and things like that to be built right next to it. But I suppose that's up for San Antonians to decide. Nevertheless, Texans are now fired up, ready to keep on fighting, and so we're going to move on to what becomes the last battle of the Texas Revolution, the Battle of San Jacinto. At San Jacinto, before we saw a 14-day standoff or a 13-day standoff and then a 4-hour-long battle. This time, Texans surprise Mexican forces, including Santa Anna himself, and just annihilate and destroy them, catching them while they're off guard, while they were sleeping, and catching them completely by surprise, and destroy or capture all of their forces there, including Santa Anna himself, in a matter of about 20 minutes. So this one is quick and simple, and in the end, Santa Anna himself even is captured. And you may have heard the phrase before, "Remember the Alamo," and used it in some kind of a battle cry, war cry almost capacity. And that supposedly is what happened at the Battle of San Jacinto, that the Texan forces, as they attacked Mexican forces here, that's what they yelled: "Remember the Alamo, remember the Alamo," that this was them taking their revenge, avenging the deaths of the people of the Alamo, making their deaths worth something, and fighting to, continue what they had started. So with the Battle of San Jacinto, with Santa Anna literally captured and, in shackles, as it were, Santa Anna is forced to grant Texas his independence. That's kind of the deal is made, is we'll let you go if you sign and give us our independence, give us what we want. And so he does. So Texas gains their independence. As a result of the Battle of San Jacinto, Santa Anna is begrudgingly forced to sign it over, and keep that in mind because that'll come back. And so we see Texas now becoming an independent country, the Republic of Texas, or as sort of a nickname, the Lone Star Republic. That's because, on the American flag, the stars represent the states. And since Texas is on its own, they are a lone star. And that's why today they call themselves the Lone Star State. But anyway, as a Republic of Texas, it's an independent country, recognized officially by the United States as an independent nation, and that's how it's going to exist for about the next 9 years while the United States gets together whether or not they're going to admit Texas as a new state. Santa Anna is set free, goes back to Mexico where he is overthrown, and the new government of Mexico doesn't want to recognize officially the independence of Texas. And so Santa Anna's mad about it, says, "Well, you made me do it. I was in handcuffs. What could I possibly have said?" And the new Mexican government is not thrilled about it either. So keep all of those things in mind. So Texas becomes an independent nation. Now, it was truly the intention at that point for Texas leaders like Sam Houston. They did want statehood. They didn't intend to remain an independent nation forever. It was their intention to apply for statehood in the United States. But they are not granted statehood immediately, and therefore that's why they're going to exist as an independent country for some time, because statehood wouldn't happen. There were obstacles to statehood. So they apply for statehood initially, but it is not rejected, but it can't go forward. It gets blocked. It gets in a gridlock, a stalemate in Congress, because there was a lot of opposition, obviously, to Texas admission. There were a lot of people that were saying, no, we don't need to admit Texas, and would not vote for it. And the reason for that, there's two real things. One is slavery. Big reason for that is slavery. Texas would be a slave state, and we see that same issue and concern that we've seen before about adding another slave state, that's going to mean slave states have more power, that they're tipping the balance in favor of slave states, and concerns about future expansion of slavery west and west and west. So that's a big reason. The other reason why some people were opposed to the admission of Texas in 1836 and voted no on it, or would not vote yes, was concern over Mexico. They realized, they knew very well that Mexico was this thing wasn't as nice and neat of a deal as they would like. Mexico is not happy over losing Texas. They are not recognizing Texas as an independent country. In other words, they're still claiming it, or at least part of it, to be theirs. And there were great concerns that if we annex Texas, that's going to make Mexico mad. It could inaugurate war with Mexico. It will confirm their suspicions that we were plotting to get Texas all along. And so there were a lot of not enough people to say yes to Texas admission. So Texas exists as its own country for the next 9 years. Texas will be admitted as a new state in the United States in 1845. So it is annexed 9 years later in 1845 in kind of an interesting and unusual way. Texas is annexed by joint resolution. So a joint resolution is passed in 1845 in order to admit Texas as a new state. Now, what a joint resolution is, a joint resolution is simply a measure, an act of Congress, a law that requires a majority vote. 51% vote yes, it goes through. Most of what Congress does is by joint resolution. If they pass a tax, if they create a national bank, if they approve funding to build a road, if they make a new citizenship law, whatever, that is almost always done just by joint resolution. Most things, nearly everything, requires just a simple majority. But that's unusual to do that in a case like this, because you have to realize here, we are talking about acquiring territory. And not only that, we're talking about absorbing an independent nation. We're talking about absorbing another country. We would think, and in most cases, that would require a treaty. But a treaty requires 2/3 of a vote, and they weren't going to get that. So there are more people that were open to Texas admission by this point. We'll talk about that in just a second. But a treaty just wasn't going to be possible. Any other time the United States has acquired territory, Florida, Treaty of Paris, other things like that, it has been done by treaty. Louisiana Purchase was not. That was an executive action. So it's odd that sometimes these big acquisitions are done in some weird ways. But because a treaty just wasn't going to be possible, because there was still such opposition to it, they go this joint resolution route, which is a little informal, considering the fact that you are absorbing another country, which the United States did recognize as an independent country. Now, having said that, there were still more people that were on board with Texas admission than there were 9 years before. You did have enough to get it done by joint resolution. You just didn't have enough to get it done by full treaty. And the reasons for that, the reasons why some people said yes, whereas not as many people would have said yes 9 years before, is really two reasons. One is there was a growing concern that an independent Texas was a danger, that it was more of a risk to leave Texas independent, that if Texas remains independent, they could potentially become a threat, perhaps not on their own, but if they make alliances with other countries, which they were trying to do, that would be a bad idea, because Texas knows they needed support of another country. So Texas was trying to warm up to countries like Britain, and Britain was kind of flirting with Texas a little bit. So there was great concern. We don't want Texas to make an alliance with Britain, and now we have this British-Texan alliance right to our southern border. That could be potentially dangerous. There was concerns about Texas becoming an economic rival when it came to cotton production. Wouldn't it be better if it was just part of our economy instead of another economy that we are trying to compete with? So there were those concerns. There was also, for many, another big reason why Texas is annexed is manifest destiny. By this time, by 1845, manifest destiny is in high gear. You have a manifest destiny president, James K. Polk, who manifest destiny is his just ultimate goal, and Texas and Oregon and all of that is at the top of his list. He has an agenda and he's going to get it done, and Texas was one of them, and it didn't matter what it took. And so because manifest destiny was such a bigger part of the national conversation, things like, okay, if it makes a war, fine, we'll go to war over it, which they end up doing it eventually. So there was a greater sense that yes, there were risks, and yes, there were concerns, but those risks and concerns were outweighed by the benefits of gaining Texas. Now, Mexico's response to that is Mexico is not happy. As we've already mentioned, Mexico is not happy over losing Texas to begin with. They are even still arguing that they did not actually lose Texas, that this was all done in very extra legal or illegal ways, or at least not proper procedures. They are still claiming parts of Texas to belong to them. So they are not happy at all. And in fact, as part of their response, they are going to break diplomatic relations with the United States, which means cutting off like any kind of formal communication, withdraw their ambassadors and things like that. It's sort of like, it reminds me of, giving each other the silent treatment. Like when two friends get in an argument, you say, I'm not talking to you anymore. It's sort of like that, but it's much more dire than that. Breaking off diplomatic relations is like the next thing, the worst thing you can do, or the most serious, cut you can make to another nation, other than declaring war on them. Like war is usually the next step. And breaking diplomatic relations is always a precursor to war. It does not necessarily mean you will go to war, but whenever a war does break out between countries, breaking diplomatic relations is almost always the thing that happens right before that. So it doesn't make Mexico very happy at all, and it will be part of the reason why the United States is going to go to war with Mexico the following year. So that's what we're going to be concluding the chapter with next time, looking at that war with Mexico.